Ukraine, this Novorossiya concept that he's introduced to justify it historically. But we have to be concerned that he could even aim for another prize of trying to topple the reform-minded government. It is playing out that he may settle for another pattern, one that he tried in Moldova, one of pushing federalization. Because he's not rolling tanks across the border, it becomes a regional request, a reasonable request to push the federalization of Ukraine so that actors in the East, his proxies perhaps, can prevent Ukraine from acting sovereign and independent, and that he can continue to count on the levers of corruption to manipulate leaders there. So this is where the United States has kept considerable distance as Putin has snuffed out democracy in his own country. But we can take immediate steps to check his latest efforts to intimidate his neighbors. And think about during the Cold War and against all odds and all tenets of realpolitik, every White House, every US Congress championed the cause of the captive nations of Central and Eastern Europe, the nations that were locked behind the Iron Curtain. And the accession over the next 2 decades of Poland, Estonia, and these others to NATO and the European Union, they really ended the Cold War divisions and made this vision of a Euro-Poland free reality. So unfortunately, Vladimir Putin's ongoing effort to roll back freedom's gains, particularly in Ukraine, Moldova, Georgia, it puts them at risk of becoming today's captive nations. So to avoid marking the 20th anniversary this year of the fall of the Berlin Wall, with the erection of a new wall separating a democratic and prosperous Europe from an authoritarian and corrupt Eurasia, the United States itself needs a strategy for Europe's East. As European leaders were meeting at their Eastern Partnership Summit on the future of European integration, we weren't there. We don't have a seat at the table. But the future of even the EU's relationship with these nations will have enormous strategic consequences for American interests. This Eastern Partnership, the EU initiative, it began as a modest effort to strengthen the ties of Europe's East to the EU, but without offering the prospect of membership. And until recently, it had become the best way to foster the transformation of post-Soviet nations by offering political affiliation, economic integration, and the elimination of barriers to travel with Europe. And this partnership was driven by attraction, not coercion. And its powerful unspoken premise is that sovereignty requires democracy. But this goal is all in jeopardy right now. So as the EU tries to think through its next steps, this is where the US has an opportunity to join with its European allies to increase the odds that these nations will have the option of a European future. And it's important to remember that traditionally America has driven each wave of European integration, using NATO first to pave the way for EU enlargement. But since Russia's invasion of Georgia, we've stepped back. But if we sit on the sidelines as this plays out, the next chapter of European integration and potentially ultimately enlargement will fail. So the task today is a strategy that complements the Europeans' efforts to integrate their neighbors so that we help enable European integration and drive NATO enlargement. We need to be able to anticipate and counter Russian efforts to derail these nations' move towards Europe. The EU has, for example, already opened up wine imports from Moldova, for example. We should develop a package of incentives to support reformers, for example, extending our free trade agreement with Europe to include these nations. And we should lead on the security issues that are afflicting these countries because the European Union, its Eastern Partnership, doesn't even begin to address security. That means, how do you restore Georgia's path towards NATO? How do you begin a defense relationship with Moldova where one doesn't exist? And how do we help Ukraine with intelligence, energy security, and even militarily? A clear U.S. strategy towards Europe's East can give European leaders the confidence they need to take the decision that the Eastern Partnership should become a pathway for successful reformers to join, to pursue membership. And over the long haul, this vision should include a democratic Russia. But we have to recognize that the path to reform in Moscow itself, and therefore a united Europe, it might actually begin with pro-European choices taking hold in Kyiv and Chisinau and Tbilisi. So to make this possible, what is our strategic response? How do we forge a strategic response to deter Putin today, not just for the moment? We do much of what we're doing, and we raise the costs. We talk about these sanctions that we're threatening to impose if he further destabilizes. We disrupt some of these economic deals, $60 billion in capital flight out of the Russian economy. But we also recommit to first principles, to the vision, what guides this, what are we trying to do here? Trying to create a Europe that can include Ukraine. And Obama, just last week, standing by Chancellor Merkel in the Rose Garden, used the words that our objective is a Euro-Poland free. But our strategy also has to be to go big on Ukraine. How do we support Ukraine so that it doesn't just survive, but it thrives with a robust economic, diplomatic, and military strategy reinforced by energy efficiency, anti-corruption efforts? We have to revitalize the NATO alliance. We have to recommit to European security, in turn have Europe recommit to their own defense. Halt our force reductions in Europe, order a review of that, push our European allies to integrate their defenses to have more of an impact, more radical integration, and to move NATO more permanently to its new members with forces in the East. We need to harden the soft spots with strategies on Moldova and Georgia to deter him to be tempted. And we need to respond to aggression in the East by consolidating the South. That means bringing a country like Montenegro in, working on Bosnia, finishing the Cyprus settlement. But we also need a new partnership initiative for the countries in the East that aren't headed towards membership in the institutions, Azerbaijan, Armenia, to help them protect their sovereignty, their territorial integrity. And a strategic response, I think, requires that we expand the playing field. And so as we draw down our forces in Afghanistan, that we not signal to Russia's neighbors on the other side in Central Asia that we're out of there, that we're withdrawing, but that we have a diplomatic strategy to remain engaged in a country like Kazakhstan. And that we broaden this with energy and help understand that energy has fueled Putin's appetite. And so by harnessing the US shale gas revolution, our natural gas exports, getting them out into the global market, and having the European Union treat energy like trade as a single commodity where they can resist and negotiate, force Gazprom to play by market rules, that checks much of Putin's power. At the end of the day, this is about our long-term competitiveness. The long-term competitiveness of what we represent, our values of free markets, democracies, transparency. And so if you think about a strategic response to Putin today, you bring in what we're trying to do on a trade agenda by forging a free trade agreement with Europe at the same time we do so with Asia, that we set the terms of the debate and what Russia has to engage economically, not through coercion, but we've helped set global standards and norms of transparency and market regulation. We do the same that we're doing with NATO as NATO reaches out to forge, as it's doing this fall, global partners. NATO allies working with our Middle East allies and our Asian allies so that a country like Russia sees the scale and scope of our alliance structure. And ultimately, the long-term strategy is Russia and the Russian people who need a voice here. Let me come to a conclusion by coming back a little bit to history. As we try to reshape an effective response, history can inspire us a little bit here. So in 1947, a communist rebellion in Greece was threatening to topple the government in Athens and send Greece and Turkey into an open conflict. Southeast Europe was devastated from World War II, struggling to cope internally and economically languishing. Moscow Stalin saw a soft opening, a soft spot, and was actively working to destabilize the region with the aim of altering the outcome of World War II and driving Greece and Turkey into Moscow's orbit. We were reeling from World War II. The Soviet Union was even more powerful, more equitable in military power than to us today. And yet in March of 1947, President Truman went to the US Congress to deliver a major address where he committed the United States to Greece and Turkey, backing up bilateral security guarantees with $400 million in assistance. Shortly thereafter, NATO was formed, but without Greece and Turkey. 1950, Korean forces come pouring across the 38th parallel, dragging us into a war in Asia. And facing incredible challenges in Asia and Europe, the Truman administration responded decisively and rallied NATO to invite Greece and Turkey to join the alliance. Athens and Ankara received invitations in 1951, joined very quickly in 1952. Allied leaders acted as Stalin's revanchist and expansionist policies were increasingly becoming apparent in the West. We didn't appreciate them at first. And as tensions were mounting at the dawn of the Cold War, this decision extended NATO's borders up to the Soviet Union's borders, right up to the Soviet Union's borders for the first time. But far from provoking the Soviet Union, this move brought stability to Southeast Europe by foreclosing options for Moscow to do mischief-making. Can you imagine the 50s, 60s, 70s with Greece and Turkey not anchored within our community? The Kremlin moved on to other proxies. So as much as Putin casts aspersions on the Bolsheviks, he follows in their tradition as much as the expansionist czars, perhaps. So today, the Atlantic community faces a comparable set of challenges as Vladimir Putin leads a resurgent Russia to take back ever more aggressive actions towards its unprotected neighbors. Much like Stalin, Putin seeks to act against soft targets where he can win. Today's soft targets are those nations that stand between NATO and the European Union and this gray zone. The annexation of Crimea has been the first land grab in Europe since World War II. Yet it's the natural outcome of his policy of fueling Russian revanchism and nationalism. He's been clear and consistent, even if we didn't want to hear him. He's meticulously laid the groundwork. In 2008, President Medvedev spelled out the doctrine of the privileged sphere of interest in which Russia reserved the right to exert influence over those nations of the former Soviet Union. The Kremlin sharpened this policy with an explicit commitment to defend the rights of not only ethnic Russians, but also Russian speakers outside its borders. And Putin has laid the conceptual groundwork for a new ideology of ethno-nationalism, Novorossiya, even while he's stymied efforts to resolve these other conflicts. At the same time, we actually know that he had developed contingency plans for an invasion of Georgia, for an annexation of Crimea. He patiently waited at home to rebuild Russia's strength, reinvest in the military, and prepared to strike when opportunities present themselves. So, the challenge is that after the Bucharest summit, he shifted from a passive to active stance and began laying the groundwork to create his own opportunities. And indeed, even at that Bucharest summit, he taunted leaders that Ukraine wasn't even an independent state. Crimea has played out according to this playbook. He saw leverage over Ukraine evaporating when Yanukovych fled, and a sense of the instability in the first few days of this new fragile government, he moved subtly but decisively to occupy Crimea in 20 days. In 20 days, he annexed it. This is not the last move, it's the latest move. He's did so in Georgia, now in Ukraine. We'll see targets of opportunities we can act to advance into his agenda more brazenly. He likely won't be challenging NATO head-on militarily, but I think we should expect some more sophisticated campaigns to destabilize the Baltic states by using money, media, influence these nations to provoke and incentivize ethnic Russian populations to challenge, even take control of state structures. He'll also continue the campaign to penetrate, manipulate other vulnerable countries in Central Europe, such as Hungary, Bulgaria, where Russia has systematically bought up the energy infrastructure, seeding dissent within NATO and the EU. Anschluss with Belarus, land grabs in Azerbaijan and Kazakhstan offer Putin soft targets, but the most vulnerable may be those that are most decidedly moving to the west, Ukraine, Georgia, Moldova. Putin's on a roll, and I think the flashpoint for armed conflict, however, remains in Europe's east. So as long as the nations between NATO and Russia are trapped in the gray zone, Western commitments are tenuous while Putin's intentions are clear. The tools are asymmetric. While the West may be more effective in the long run, Putin's game plan may deprive these countries of a long run. So I think to stabilize this continent, dramatic action is required. Perhaps taking a cue from the Truman administration, just imagine if we actually acted to have NATO agree to bring in Georgia, Ukraine, and Moldova through an exceptional new pathway. But no doubt many allies, many Americans would be very skeptical of this plan, just as we were of accepting Greece in the throes of a civil war, or Turkey, a Muslim nation that was mostly in Asia in 1952. But the reason such a decisive plan worked was American leadership. So to secure Europe today, in 2014, the United States must convince its allies it's fully committed to their security. It means an initiative that would be coupled with a concerted strategy to reestablish America's unwavering commitment to European security. So Putin will likely retaliate, but decisive action quickly can limit his options. If we rely on the goodwill towards his neighbors, we just might look back with envy on Russia's relatively bloodless seizure of Crimea. So I'd close with saying that the overlooked point is Russia. Yes, he's trying to restart and regather the Russian areas of Russian empire, but he's first used this crisis to consolidate his power at home, to consolidate his own control. He saw about 200 protesters come to the streets in December 2001 when Russian elections played out fraudulently. He saw 50,000 Russians hit the streets even in March, right after the annexation of Crimea. That, I think, has been his first target, to consolidate control at home. So our challenge today is how we deter Mr. Putin to avoid further war. how we avoid trapping his neighbors behind a new dividing line, and how we avoid abandoning the Russian people, a great people and a great nation that ultimately deserve better than they have with Mr. Putin. So thank you very much.
Thank you for very informative. Thank you for a very informative talk, and we'd like to leave you with a little memory from Cleveland Orchestra.
Terrific. Oh, fantastic.
Thank you. We appreciate your time. Thank you.
Sir. Thank you.
I want to thank you again for coming and listening to this informative speech today. I urge you to take the material of the council, the schedules, and the applications. I like to tell you that in a couple weeks we're going to have a state-of-the-art internet site for the council. We will be very interactive with Facebook and Twitter. And we like the new group here in the room to join and leave their emails or send it by the application. I want to thank the entire staff of the council for making arrangements for this evening, for this great event. And we'd like to see you on June 2nd. If you join us for the annual meeting, it's free of charge. And you will get to learn more about the council and hear what Barbara Snyder has to say about Case Western and the city. Thank you very much.